Hi, my name is Bente, I'm the Norse Witch, and welcome to my third video in the series on the runes. And this time we will talk about the first 8 runes in the Elder Futhark. But of course, first, Patron shoutout time. Thank you really much to Ines, Tiffany, Amy, Rhiannon, Dario, Colette, Soren, Braden, Diego, Bethany, Tel, Timothy, Coffee, Bjorn, Scylla, Ash, Lorna, Lucy, and Joss. Wow, there are so many already. Oh my god, I'm so thankful. And now, let us talk about the runes, shall we? So yeah, as I already said, this time we will talk about the first 8 runes in the Elder Futhark, which are the first Aett. And I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly because I have no clue how to pronounce that. I don't even know how to pronounce that in German, so yeah. But yeah, the Elder Futhark is oftentimes separated into 3 different groups of 8 runes each, and they're called the 3 Aetts, hopefully. We also see this separation sometimes in some inscriptions, but it's not really known yet why we have this separation, why it is on the inscriptions. We don't really know. These 3 groups, or Aetts, are Freyrs or Freyjas Aett. That's the first one, that's the one that we will talk about today. The second one is Heimdall's or Odin's Aett, and the last one is Tyr's Aett. And since I thought that maybe a video per rune would be kind of overkill, I thought it would make sense to separate the videos on the runes or on the meanings of the runes into these 3 Aetts. The first group or Aett, the Freyrs or Freyjas Aett that we will talk about today, kind of shows basic human life. It shows your property, it shows your wealth, it shows agriculture, fertility, beauty, sex, also some destructive forces, of course. Yeah, stuff like that. That's usually the topics from this first group. And the runes in this first group that we will talk about today are Fehu, Uruz, Thurisaz, Ansuz, Raidho, Kenaz, Gebo, and Wunjo. And you don't want to know how often I had to repeat this sentence. Wow. But before we start with the first rune, I want to just quickly say these are my personal interpretations. I read a lot of books about the runes, I read the rune poems, and I basically took whatever made sense to me, and that is what I would advise you to do too. Whatever I'm saying in this video, take whatever resonates with you, whatever doesn't, just ignore it. And please make sure to also read a lot of books and the rune poems on the runes yourself. I will also read to you the chapters from the rune poems about the runes that I'm talking about, so that you know like what the primary source is basically. But yeah, please make sure to also read books and listen to other people, what their interpretations of the runes are, because interpretations can vary very much. So whatever makes sense to me might not make sense to you, and that's totally fine. These are just my interpretations. But let's start with the first rune, which is Fehu, and I will always put the rune here so you know what I'm talking about. The name of the first rune, Fehu, can be translated to cattle, and it's Freyrs or Freyjas rune. And that's also why this first group, the first Aett, is called Freyjas or Freyrs Aett, because it starts with their rune. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem about Fehu says, "Wealth be by all very much welcomed. Each man shall deal it out freely if he will from the Lord get approval." While the Norwegian rune poem says, "Wealth causes trouble among relatives. The wolf is raised in the forest." And the Icelandic rune poem says, "Wealth is trouble among relatives and fire of the sea and path of the serpent." So we see a general theme already about wealth and prosperity, but also kind of struggles that come with it when people get maybe envious or greedy. But why the connection between wealth and cattle? Back when the runes were used, people were farmers. At least most of them were farmers. They were really dependent on whatever they were able to grow, and of course on their cattle. So the cattle that they had was basically their wealth. That was like money is for us today. The rune Fehu is usually connected to like topics like mobile property, wealth, fertility, creativity, and sex. I always kind of see it as some kind of energy or potential that could lead to either wealth directly, or kind of lead to resources that could then lead to wealth. So for example, like, of course, it could mean money in general. Back then it was cattle, because that was what made you wealthy. But also it can mean creativity, because creativity leads to something. When you are creative, something new comes into being. So for example, if you're an artist, then you create something, and this something can either be a resource that you use to gain wealth, or you could sell it and get wealth from it. But also, of course, fertility, like the fertility when you're a farmer, or you were a farmer, and your land is fertile, that will lead to you being wealthy because you have a lot of goods that you can sell. And of course, that also applies to sex. I mean, fertility in human form, sexual energy. Next rune, the second rune in the Elder Futhark is Uruz, which means aurochs. And that is basically, or was, a wild ox. Is extinct. I think it has been extinct since the 17th century or something, for a long time. But yeah, that is what it means, at least in one rune poem, because two say different things. It's a little bit tricky. Let me read them to you. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says about Uruz: Aurochs is fearless and greatly horned, a very fierce beast. It fights with its horns. A famous roamer of the moor, it is a very courageous animal. While the Icelandic rune poem says about Uruz: Drizzle is weeping of the clouds, and destruction of the hay harvest, and abhorrence of the herdsman. So, you see, Anglo-Saxon rune poem directly has the connection to the aurochs, but the Icelandic rune poem basically talks about rain. Okay. Lastly, the Norwegian rune poem says: Slag comes from poor iron. Often the reindeer runs over the hard-frozen snow. So again, something completely different. It's a little bit weird. But of course, we have to keep in mind here that all of these three rune poems aren't about the Elder Futhark. They're about the Anglo-Saxon and the younger Futhark. So, for example, in the Norwegian and the Icelandic rune poems, which are about the younger Futhark, some runes have kind of merged, and just in general the meanings have changed. And in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, I feel like it's more accurate to the Elder Futhark, because the Anglo-Saxon Futhark has more runes than the Elder Futhark, so no meanings were merged into one rune, but they were kind of more like split. But yeah, most people go with the first interpretation from the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, where it relates to the aurochs. And that is also what personally makes the most sense to me. When you look at the rune Uruz as symbolizing the aurochs, this rune is kind of connected to health, vital energy, like physical energy, a lot of strength, but also about manifestation. And we will get into that later, because the first ones are a little bit more obvious. If you look at an animal like an aurochs, a wild ox, it has a lot of strength, it's big, it's huge, it has horns, so of course, yeah, it is very much able to defend itself. So that is of course where like the vital energy, physical energy, and the strength aspects come from. But of course, aurochs were also hunted, that's why they're extinct now. And yeah, that is where the healing aspect comes from, because of course people were eating this animal too. But where does the aspect of manifestation come from? If you look at Uruz as an aurochs, you can basically interpret that as being Auðumla, the primordial cow, who not only fed Ymir, the first giant, but who also licked the first god from an ice block. So this cow, Auðumla, basically manifested the first god into existence. So that is where the manifestation aspect comes from. And to me personally, that makes total sense. So I kind of like to see Fehu as the potential energy, while Uruz is something that manifests this potential into physical existence. But enough talk about Uruz, let's come into Thurisaz, which means either giant, like a Jotun, or thorn. The Norwegian rune poem says the following about the Thurisaz rune. Thurs causes illness in women. Few rejoice at bad luck. The Icelandic rune poem says the following. Thurs is the torment of women and the dweller in the rocks or cliffs. and the man, maybe husband, of Varðruna. And lastly, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem says, "Thorn is the most sharp for every thane who grasps it. It is harmful, exceeding cruel to every man who rests among them." So we have Thurisaz as being a Jotun, and we have also Thorn. That is where these two meanings come from. And we also already kind of see the basic meaning of this rune, which isn't the most nicest meaning in the world. Because this rune has connections to the Jotuns, it of course also has connections to chaotic natural forces and destructive natural forces. This rune is basically a directed, aggressive force. It can be used for destruction, it can cause a lot of chaos, but of course it can also be used as protection. You can use this rune as protection against your enemies. You can use it, for example, in protection spells, especially as like a return to sender spell. And because it has also kind of this connection to an aggressive, active kind of protection, it's also connected to Thor, because who's the one who protects everyone from the Jotuns? It's Thor, who always slays these Jotuns. But he's not doing that in a peaceful way, he's smashing them. So he also kind of embodies this active, really active, really destructive, aggressive force. This rune, of course, when used, can be really dangerous. So if you're not able to kind of work with this energy and direct it perfectly where you want it, it can cause a whole lot of destruction. So best make sure that you're able to properly direct this kind of energy before you use it. What I find interesting is that some people also kind of see a phallic resemblance, and I see it because of this active, directed energy. I don't know, this energy kind of, doesn't it kind of resemble an ejaculation? So I kind of see it, and I also kind of don't see it. What do you think? Then next, from chaos, we come to order. We come to the rune Ansuz, which translates to a god. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem about Ansuz says the following: "Mouth is the chieftain of all speech, mainstay of wisdom, comfort to wise ones, for every noble earl, hope and happiness." The Icelandic rune poem says, "Ace is the olden father, Odin, Asgard's chieftain, and the leader of Valhall." And lastly, the Norwegian rune poem says, "River mouth is the way of most journeys, but a scabbard of swords." So we see there's a lot of symbolization of, first, Odin. Odin is really connected to this rune, it's basically his rune, and also to the mouth, to everything that's kind of oral, that has to do with communication. It's a very air element rune. For me, it's personally the rune that resembles the air element the most, because it's basically connected to everything that has to do with air. It has to do with, as I said, communication, but also inspiration, poetry, wisdom, the breath of life even. I mean, that's all also kind of connected to Odin, because air is kind of also his element, but that's kind of all that has to do with Ansuz. Also, as I already said, this rune also represents order, because this rune is basically the rune of the Aesir, and the Aesir are kind of the force of order that stands in the way of the force of chaos, the Jotuns. It's always these kinds of energies, yeah, kind of fighting against each other, order and chaos. So yeah, it's a very kind of straightforward rune, I feel like, about all kinds of mental powers, communication, poetry, wisdom, anything that basically comes out of your mouth or has to do with your mouth and breathing and speaking. So if you look at it physically, it also has connections to your lungs and to your mouth and everything that has to do with that. Next up, the next rune is Raidho, which translates to cart or chariot or even riding. This is what the Icelandic rune poem has to say about Raidho. "Riding is joy of the rider, and a speedy journey and the labor of the horse." And the Norwegian rune poem says, "Riding is said to be worst for horses. Regin forged the best sword." And lastly, the Anglo-Saxon rune poem says, "Riding is in the hall for a warrior, soft, more strenuous when astride, a great stallion pounding the long mile paths." So we see there's a lot of riding, a lot of horses, a lot of being transported somewhere, a lot of journeying. Raidho symbolizes both the vehicle, so a chariot or a cart or something like that, and the riding itself. It represents basically everything that has to do with movement. So whenever you go on a journey, that is where Raidho comes into play, even when you just take a walk, but also if you journey between the worlds, or if you do something like spirit flight, trans-journeying, astral projection, that all has to do with Raidho energy. Because of its connection to wheels and wheels turning, Raidho also has a connection to cyclical, rhythmic motions, everything that kind of stays the same and repeats itself. So, for example, the wheel of the year or the path of the earth around the sun. And because of that, it also represents divine order. I'm sorry if everything looks a little bit different, the battery died. But I was about to tell you about Kenaz, which is the 6th rune in the Elder Futhark, and it means torch. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says the following about Kenaz. Torch to the living familiar aflame is blinding and brilliant. It burns most often where royal folk within are resting. While the Norwegian rune poem and the Icelandic rune poem say something a little bit different. The Norwegian one says the following. Sore is fatal to children, death makes the corpse pale. And the Icelandic rune poem says, sore is the bale of children and a scourge and the house of rotten flesh. So again, we see it's the same as with Uruz. Kind of the Norwegian and the Icelandic rune poem say something completely different than the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. Again, probably due to the fact that for the younger Futhark, multiple rune meanings have been squashed into one. And again, most people with Kenaz go with the torch interpretation. So what is a torch? It is fire that is in control of a human. So we can basically look at the torch and whatever we can do with the torch. For example, just like in the Anglo-Saxon rune poem, a torch and basically controlled fire, of course, like a bonfire, for example, is where people are gathering because they're making their food over the fire, they are eating there, so it's a merry good time. But also a torch, for example, is of course used to light the way. You use fire so that you see where you are going. So of course, physical and also spiritual enlightenment is also one of the meanings of Kenaz. But of course, fire was also used in craftsmanship, if we look at a forge, for example. So Kenaz has also very close ties to everything that has to do with crafting and with creativity. But lastly, of course, torches were also used to protect yourself from wild animals, because most wild animals are afraid of fire. So controlled fire is great for protection. So that is also one of the connotations of Kenaz. And now the second to last one that we will look at today, which is Gebo, and it means gift. And about this rune, we actually only have a verse from the Anglo-Saxon rune poem because the rune Gebo doesn't exist in the younger Futhark. So let me read to you the verse from the Anglo-Saxon rune poem. Giving to all men brings credit and honor, help and worthiness, and to every outcast is the estate and substance that have naught else. So we have kind of the meaning of giving something and being hospitable to other people. So Gebo is a rune of hospitality, generosity, exchange, but Gebo doesn't only represent getting something or giving something. The big thing about Gebo is that it represents balance. So you give something, and for which you give, you also receive something back. It's an exchange, there's balance, that is very important with this rune. And it also doesn't only have to do with physical things. It's not only about the exchange of gifts or the exchange of money, it can also be an exchange of energy, for example, or an exchange of knowledge. Basically, everything where you exchange something with either another human, or maybe with a god or a goddess, or even with an animal. I mean, an animal gives you love, and you give the animal food, and also your love, so there's also an exchange there. But due to this symbolization of exchange, of also energy and gifts and stuff, this rune also represents offerings that you would give to your gods or goddesses, or it's a rune of sacrifice and also self-sacrifice. And this also shows that when you give offerings to a god or a goddess, it's not because of a pact or something, it's not like you're buying yourself something, it's not like you give an offering to a god or a goddess so that they do something for you. but it's a freely given exchange between energy, offerings. The gods do something for you sometimes, and sometimes you do something for the gods. And then lastly, the last rune for today is Wunjo, which means joy or bliss. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says the following about Wunjo. Joy is for one who knows little of woe, pains and sorrows, and to him who has power and bliss and buildings good enough. And again, we don't have anything from the Icelandic or Norwegian rune poem about Wunjo because Wunjo doesn't exist in the younger Futhark. And honestly, this interpretation is kind of straightforward. This rune is about joy and bliss and having a good time, having a good life, but not like so generally speaking. It's a little bit more specific because it's specifically the joy that you feel in social settings. If you have, for example, a good time with your friends because you're out to dinner with them, you're having a good time with your family or with your chosen family, just in general, the joy that you get from being with other people and spending time with them, and just knowing that there is someone who will support you, who's looking out for you, who loves you. So of course there's also this big aspect of harmony between people and peace, and yeah, it's not a group of people fighting, it's a group of people being in peace and harmony, having a really good time. And those were all the runes that I wanted to get into today. In the next video, of course, I will get into the second group and then lastly to the third group, and afterwards I will get more into bind runes and rune divination and everything around that, so that you don't just get the meanings of the runes but also how to apply them, how to work with them, how to divine with them. As always, I really hope that you enjoyed this video. I was kind of nervous about filming this. As always, feel free to subscribe and give a thumbs up, and maybe follow me on Instagram or TikTok, or check out my online shop, or maybe even consider becoming my patron. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!